The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Windsor Castle as Kate Middleton walked through the familiar corridors. Her heels clicked softly against the polished stone, each step measured and deliberate. She had learned long ago that every movement, every expression, every breath was scrutinized by countless eyes. Today would be no different, though she had no idea how different it would truly become. The royal family was gathering for what was supposed to be a routine meeting about upcoming charitable events. Kate had been looking forward to it, actually. These meetings were one of the few times she felt she could contribute meaningfully to the royal duties that had become her life. Her passion for children's welfare and mental health awareness had given her a sense of purpose within the rigid structure of royal protocol. She entered the ornate drawing room where several family members had already assembled. William was there, of course, standing near the tall windows that overlooked the gardens. His face was serious as he spoke quietly with his private secretary. Kate caught his eye and smiled, receiving a warm nod in return. Their connection, even in formal settings like this, remained strong after all these years. Charles sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, reading through documents with his characteristic intensity. Papers were spread before him, and Kate could see the careful notes he had made in the margins. The king had always been meticulous about his duties, and since ascending to the throne, that attention to detail had only intensified. The weight of the crown seemed to have aged him, though he carried it with the dignity that came from a lifetime of preparation. But it was Camilla who drew Kate's attention as she entered the room. The queen consort was seated to Charles's right, her posture perfect, as always, her hands folded elegantly in her lap. There was something in her expression, though, something Kate couldn't quite identify. A subtle satisfaction, perhaps, or a hint of anticipation that seemed oddly out of place for what should have been a straightforward meeting about charity work. Kate took her designated seat, smoothing her navy blue dress as she settled into the chair. The color had been chosen carefully, professional, respectful, but not so muted as to fade into the background. Every choice in royal life was strategic, and Kate had learned to navigate these waters with increasing skill over the years. The conversation began predictably enough. Charles discussed upcoming engagements, the need to coordinate schedules, and the importance of maintaining consistent messaging across all royal charitable initiatives. Kate listened attentively, occasionally taking notes in her small leather-bound notebook. She had developed her own system for tracking commitments and ideas, something that helped her feel more organized in a role that often felt chaotic despite its rigid structure. As the meeting progressed, Kate noticed that Camilla's contributions seemed particularly pointed today. Every suggestion seemed to subtly redirect attention toward causes that Camilla favored, while Kate's own initiatives were met with polite but dismissive responses. When Kate mentioned her upcoming visit to a children's hospital, Camilla immediately suggested that perhaps a more established charity might benefit more from royal attention. After all, Camilla said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, we must be strategic about where we invest our time. Some causes have proven track records, while others. She let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Kate felt her cheeks warm slightly, but her expression remained perfectly composed. Years of dealing with both supportive and critical media coverage had taught her to maintain her poise even when faced with subtle challenges. She simply nodded and made a note in her book, though her pen pressed perhaps a bit harder against the paper than necessary. William shifted in his chair, clearly having caught the undertone of his stepmother's comment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. The dynamics in these family meetings were complex, requiring careful navigation of relationships that were both personal and professional, loving and competitive. The tension in the room was subtle, but palpable. Charles seemed focused on his papers, perhaps deliberately avoiding the undercurrents of the conversation. Or perhaps he was simply absorbed in the details of royal duty, as he so often was. Kate had learned to read the moods of the family members over the years, and today something felt different. As the meeting continued, Camilla's comments became increasingly pointed. When Kate suggested expanding the mental health awareness campaign she had been working on, Camilla wondered aloud whether the public was becoming fatigued by such initiatives. When Kate mentioned her interest in supporting young mothers, Camilla suggested that perhaps traditional women's charities were more appropriate venues for such concerns. Each comment was delivered with perfect politeness, the kind of refined, passive aggression that could only be mastered through years of practice in high society circles. Kate recognized it for what it was, but protocol demanded that she respond with equal politeness, acknowledging each suggestion with grace while internally feeling increasingly frustrated. The other attendees in the room seemed to sense the tension as well. Private secretaries exchanged glances, and even the normally chatty younger royals had fallen silent. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken words and carefully controlled emotions. Kate found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since joining this family. The girl who had once felt nervous about attending royal events was now a confident woman who could hold her own in any gathering. But moments like this reminded her that despite all her growth and adaptation, there were still dynamics at play that she was only beginning to understand. The meeting dragged on, with each agenda item becoming a subtle battleground. Kate's suggestions were met with increasingly creative objections, while ideas that aligned with Camilla's vision were enthusiastically endorsed. It was like watching a chess match where the rules weren't entirely clear, and Kate was beginning to suspect she wasn't the only one playing the game. By the time they reached the final items on the agenda, Kate's composure had been tested repeatedly. Her hands remained steady as she took notes, her voice calm as she responded to questions, her facial expressions perfectly appropriate. But inside, she was beginning to feel the strain of maintaining such careful control in the face of what felt like deliberate provocation. The meeting was supposedly about serving the people, about using their platform to make a positive difference in the world. But it had become something else entirely, a careful dance of power and influence, with Kate increasingly feeling like she was dancing alone. As she looked around the room at the faces of people who were both her family and her colleagues, she wondered if this was what her royal life would always be like. The morning sun that had seemed so promising when she first arrived had shifted, casting different shadows across the room. And as Kate maintained her perfect composure, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to change, though she had no way of knowing just how dramatically the day would unfold. The lunch break provided a brief respite from the tension that had been building throughout the morning meeting. Kate found herself walking through the castle gardens, seeking a moment of peace among the perfectly manicured hedges and blooming flower beds. The fresh air felt good against her skin, and she took several deep breaths, trying to center herself before the afternoon session. William joined her on the gravel path, his long strides easily matching her more measured pace. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both understanding that sometimes no words were needed. Their marriage had taught them both the value of simply being present for each other, especially during challenging times. That was quite something this morning, William finally said, his voice carefully neutral. He had learned the art of diplomatic speech from birth, but Kate could hear the underlying concern in his tone. Kate nodded, choosing her words carefully. Even in private moments like this, she was aware that palace staff might overhear, that casual comments could be misinterpreted or repeated. Every family has its dynamics, she replied simply, though they both knew this was about much more than ordinary family tensions. They paused beside a fountain where the gentle splash of water provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Kate watched the way the sunlight caught the water droplets, creating tiny rainbows in the air. These small moments of beauty had become increasingly important to her as she navigated the complexities of royal life. "She's been different lately," William observed, and Kate knew immediately that he was referring to Camilla, more assertive about certain things. Kate considered this carefully. She had noticed the same thing, though she wasn't entirely sure when the change had begun. It had been gradual, like the shifting of seasons, almost imperceptible until suddenly it was undeniable. Perhaps she's finding her voice as queen consort, Kate suggested diplomatically. But even as she said it, Kate knew there was more to it than that. The comments during the meeting had felt personal, targeted in a way that went beyond professional disagreements or different priorities. There had been an edge to Camilla's words, a subtle sharpness that suggested deeper motivations. They walked back toward the castle, their brief moment of tranquility coming to an end. Kate could see staff members moving purposefully through the corridors, preparing for the afternoon session. The machinery of royal life never stopped, never paused for personal concerns or family tensions. As they re-entered the drawing room, Kate noticed that the seating arrangement had been subtly altered during the break. Her chair had been moved slightly further from the table, while Camilla's position seemed more prominent. It was a small change, barely noticeable to most, but Kate had learned to pay attention to such details. In royal circles, even the smallest adjustments could carry significant meaning. The afternoon session began with discussions about upcoming international visits. This was territory where Kate had hoped to find more solid ground. Her successful solo trip to Denmark the previous year had been well received, and she had been looking forward to building on that experience. She had prepared extensively for this part of the meeting, researching potential destinations and causes that aligned with her interests and expertise. But as she began to outline her thoughts on a proposed visit to highlight environmental conservation efforts, Camilla interrupted with what seemed like genuine concern. "Oh, my dear," she said with a sympathetic smile, "I'm not sure that's quite the right fit. Environmental issues can be so politically sensitive, and we wouldn't want any missteps." Kate felt her heart sink slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I've been working with the environmental team for months on this," she said calmly. "We've identified several non-political initiatives that focus on community action rather than policy." "Of course you have," Camilla replied, her tone managing to be both supportive and dismissive simultaneously. "But experience in these matters is so important. Perhaps it would be better to start with something more straightforward. A nice cultural exchange, perhaps, or a traditional women's charity visit." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Kate knew that cultural exchanges and traditional charities were important, but they weren't where her passions lay. She had worked hard to carve out a niche in areas like mental health and environmental conservation, causes where she felt she could make a real difference. Charles looked up from his papers for the first time in several minutes. "What do you think, William?" he asked his son. "About the environmental focus?" Kate watched William carefully. She could see him weighing his words, considering the political implications of supporting his wife's initiative against his stepmother's concerns. The pause stretched longer than comfortable, and Kate realized with growing unease that he was genuinely torn. "I think Kate has done excellent work in environmental areas," William said finally. "But perhaps we should consider the timing. With everything else happening internationally, maybe a more neutral topic would be wise." The words hit Kate like a physical blow, though she managed not to show it. Her own husband, who had seen her passion and dedication to these causes, was effectively siding with Camilla's more conservative approach. She understood the political considerations, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. "Exactly," Camilla said with visible satisfaction. "We must always think about the bigger picture. Individual interests are important, of course, but we have to consider what's best for the institution." Kate nodded graciously, though inside she was reeling. The phrase, individual interests, felt particularly pointed, as if her carefully developed expertise and genuine passion were being dismissed as mere personal preferences. She made another note in her book, her handwriting perhaps a bit more precise than usual. The meeting continued with discussions of various other initiatives and appearances. Kate noticed that her suggestions were consistently met with gentle but firm redirection, while ideas that aligned with more traditional royal approaches were readily accepted. It was becoming clear that this wasn't really about the specific merits of any particular proposal. As the afternoon wore on, Kate found herself speaking less and less. Each time she considered raising a point or suggesting an alternative, she could feel the weight of anticipated objections. The enthusiasm she had brought to the morning meeting was gradually being eroded by the constant need to defend and justify every idea. During a brief pause while Charles consulted with his private secretary, Camilla leaned over toward Kate with what appeared to be a friendly gesture. "You know, dear," she said in a voice that was quiet enough to seem intimate but loud enough for others to hear, "I remember what it was like when I first joined this family. Everything seemed so important, so urgent. But you learn over time to pick your battles more carefully." The comment was delivered with a smile that managed to be both maternal and patronizing. Kate felt her cheeks burn slightly, but her expression remained perfectly controlled. "Thank you for the advice," she replied evenly. "I appreciate your perspective." But inside, Kate was furious. The implication that her concerns were naive, that her passion was somehow inappropriate or misguided, felt deeply unfair. She had been part of this family for over a decade. She had earned her place through years of dedicated service and careful attention to her duties. To be spoken to as if she were still a newcomer learning the ropes was both insulting and inaccurate. William seemed to sense the tension, glancing between his wife and stepmother with growing concern. But the conversation had been conducted in such perfectly polite terms that there was no obvious way to address it without seeming to overreact. The meeting finally concluded as the afternoon light began to fade. Handshakes were exchanged, pleasantries shared, and various follow-up tasks assigned. On the surface, it had been a productive day of royal planning. But Kate knew that something fundamental had shifted, and she wasn't sure she fully understood what or why. As the room began to empty, Kate gathered her papers and notes, taking extra care to ensure everything was properly organized. It was a small way of maintaining some sense of control in a situation where she felt increasingly powerless. Camilla approached her as she was closing her notebook. "I hope you didn't mind my suggestions today," she said with apparent sincerity. "I really do think it's important for us to work together effectively." Kate looked up and met Camilla's eyes directly. For just a moment, she saw something there that confirmed her suspicions. This hadn't been about charity work or royal duties or institutional considerations. This had been personal, deliberate, and calculated. But Kate's composure held firm. "Of course not," she replied with a smile that was every bit as polished as Camilla's. "We all want what's best for the family and the country." As she walked out of the room, Kate's mind was already working, trying to understand what had really happened and what it might mean for the future. She had maintained her composure throughout a day that felt like a series of small defeats, but she was beginning to realize that much larger challenges might be ahead. The evening brought an unexpected dinner gathering, hastily arranged when Charles decided that the family should continue their discussions in a more relaxed setting. Kate had been looking forward to returning home, to the relative peace of their own residence where she could finally drop the mask of perfect composure that had felt increasingly heavy throughout the day. Instead, she found herself seated at an elegant dining table in one of Windsor's smaller dining rooms, surrounded by soft candlelight and the gentle clink of fine china. The setting was beautiful, designed to create an atmosphere of intimacy and family warmth. But Kate could feel the undercurrents of tension that had been building throughout the day, now concentrated into this more confined space. The conversation over dinner began pleasantly enough. Charles spoke about his recent visit to Scotland, sharing amusing anecdotes about the people he had met and the places he had seen. His genuine affection for the country and its people was evident in his voice, and Kate found herself relaxing slightly as she listened to his stories. William contributed his own observations about recent engagements, and even Kate felt comfortable sharing some moments from her work with early childhood development programs. For a brief time, it felt like what family dinners should be like: supportive, interested relatives sharing their experiences and celebrating each other's successes. But as the meal progressed and the wine was poured, the conversation began to take on sharper edges. Camilla, who had been listening attentively to the other stories, began to steer the discussion toward more sensitive topics. She spoke about the challenges facing the monarchy in the modern world, the need for adaptation, and strategic thinking. "The public expects so much more from us now," she observed, swirling the wine in her glass. "Every appearance, every statement is analyzed and criticized. We have to be so careful about the messages we send." Kate nodded in agreement, thinking about her own experiences with media scrutiny. She had learned to navigate the intense public attention, but it remained one of the most challenging aspects of royal life. "That's why consistency is so important," Camilla continued. "When family members pursue very different agendas, it can confuse the public. They need to see us as united, working toward common goals." The comment seemed innocuous enough on the surface, but Kate felt its pointed nature immediately. The implication was clear: her focus on causes like mental health and environmental conservation was somehow creating confusion or division. "I think the public appreciates authenticity," Kate replied carefully. "When we're genuinely passionate about our work, it shows. People can tell when we're just going through the motions versus when we really care about making a difference." "Oh, absolutely," Camilla agreed with a smile that seemed almost predatory. "Passion is wonderful, but it needs to be channeled appropriately. Some causes are more suitable for our position than others." William shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly sensing the direction of the conversation, but uncertain how to intervene. Charles appeared to be focused on his meal, though Kate suspected he was listening more carefully than his demeanor suggested. "I'm curious about what makes a cause suitable," Kate said, her voice remaining level despite the growing frustration she felt inside. "Children's mental health, for instance, seems like something everyone could support." "Of course it is," Camilla replied smoothly. "But there are established organizations, proven approaches. When newer members of the family try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, it can sometimes create complications." The phrase "newer members" hit Kate like a slap. She had been part of this family for over a decade, had given birth to future kings, had devoted herself completely to royal duties and public service. To be characterized as newer felt deliberately diminishing. But Kate's training held firm. Her voice remained calm, her expression pleasant. "I've always tried to build on existing work rather than replace it," she said. "Collaboration has been my approach from the beginning." "And that's commendable," Camilla said, though her tone suggested anything but admiration. "But sometimes what feels like collaboration to one person can feel like interference to others. Established charitable partnerships can be quite sensitive to changes in approach or focus." Kate felt her hands tighten slightly around her wine glass, but she forced herself to relax her grip. She was being accused, in the most polite possible terms, of interfering with established relationships and disrupting proven systems. It was a masterful piece of character assassination, delivered with such apparent concern that it would be difficult to challenge directly. "Perhaps," Kate said slowly, "we could discuss specific examples. I'd hate to think I've inadvertently caused any problems." The challenge was subtle, but real. Kate was calling Camilla's bluff, asking for concrete evidence to support the vague accusations that had been floating through the conversation all day. Camilla's eyes flashed briefly, a moment of genuine emotion breaking through her composed facade. But she recovered quickly, her smile returning as she waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing specific, dear. Just observations about how these things tend to work. Experience, you know." It was a retreat disguised as wisdom, but Kate recognized it for what it was. Camilla couldn't provide specific examples because her complaints weren't really about Kate's work. They were about Kate herself, about her position in the family, about threats real or imagined to Camilla's own influence. Charles finally looked up from his plate, perhaps sensing that the conversation had moved beyond mere dinner chat. "I think we're all working toward the same goals," he said in a tone that suggested he wanted the topic to end. "Different approaches, perhaps, but the same fundamental commitment to service." Absolutely, Camilla agreed quickly, though Kate noticed that her smile had taken on a different quality. There was something triumphant about it now, as if Charles's diplomatic intervention was somehow a victory for her position. William finally spoke up, his voice carrying a slight edge that Kate recognized as a warning sign. Kate's work has been incredibly successful, he said firmly. The mental health initiative alone has reached millions of people. The feedback from the organizations she works with has been overwhelmingly positive. Kate felt a rush of gratitude toward her husband, even as she wondered why it had taken him so long to speak up in her defense. But she also noticed the way Camilla's expression shifted at William's words, becoming cooler and more calculating. Of course it has, Camilla replied smoothly. William, you're quite right to be proud of your wife's efforts. Family support is so important in this work. But there was something in the way she said family support that made it sound almost condescending, as if William were a protective parent defending a child rather than a husband recognizing his wife's professional accomplishments. The remainder of the dinner passed in strained politeness, with conversations carefully steered towards safer topics. But Kate could feel the weight of what had transpired, the subtle but systematic undermining of her credibility and autonomy. She had been painted as naive, interfering, and ultimately unsuited for the more serious aspects of royal responsibility. As the evening wound down and farewells were exchanged, Kate maintained her composure perfectly. She smiled appropriately, made gracious comments about the lovely evening, and thanked Charles for hosting such a productive day of meetings. But as she and William walked to their car, Kate could feel the emotional exhaustion that came from hours of careful self-control. She had successfully navigated a minefield of subtle attacks and diplomatic challenges, but the cost of that success was becoming increasingly clear. That was quite something, William said quietly as they settled into the back seat of their official car. Kate nodded, staring out the window at the passing lights. She was thinking about Camilla's smile during those final exchanges, the satisfaction that had been barely concealed beneath the surface politeness. It had been the smile of someone who believed they had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. But what exactly had that been? Kate was beginning to suspect that the day's events were about more than charitable priorities or royal protocols. Something deeper was at play, something that threatened not just her individual projects, but her entire position within the family structure. As their car pulled away from Windsor Castle, Kate realized that the real challenge wasn't what had already happened, it was what might be coming next. And despite her successful maintenance of composure throughout this difficult day, she wasn't sure she was prepared for what that might entail. 3 days later, Kate received an unexpected call requesting her immediate presence at Clarence House. The summons came through official channels, formal and urgent in a way that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. She had been in the middle of reviewing proposals for her upcoming children's hospital visit when her private secretary delivered the message with an expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying. The drive to Clarence House felt longer than usual, despite the familiar route through London streets. Kate found herself rehearsing potential conversations in her mind, trying to prepare for scenarios she couldn't quite define. The events of the previous family meeting had left her feeling unsettled, but she hadn't expected such a rapid follow-up. Upon arrival, she was escorted not to one of the formal reception rooms she might have expected, but to Charles's private study. It was a space she had visited only a few times before, filled with personal photographs, well-worn books, and the comfortable clutter that accumulated around someone who actually lived and worked in the space. Charles was standing behind his desk when she entered, his posture rigid in a way that immediately put her on alert. But it was Camilla's presence that truly surprised her. The Queen Consort was seated in a chair beside the desk, her hands folded in her lap, wearing an expression that managed to convey both concern and barely concealed satisfaction. "Kate, thank you for coming so quickly," Charles said, gesturing for her to take a seat opposite them. His voice was formal, carrying none of the warmth she was accustomed to hearing from her father-in-law. She settled into the indicated chair, her back straight, her hands composed in her lap. Years of training allowed her to project calm confidence, even as her mind raced through possible explanations for this unexpected meeting. "I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention," Charles continued, his tone careful and measured. "Regarding your recent initiatives and their impact on existing royal partnerships." Kate felt her heart begin to beat faster, but her expression remained perfectly controlled. "Of course," she replied evenly. "I'm always open to feedback about my work." Camilla leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on what seemed like genuine concern. "Oh, my dear, this is so difficult to discuss. But we received some feedback from long-standing charitable partners. Concerns about overlapping initiatives and confused messaging." "Specific concerns?" Kate asked, echoing her question from the dinner conversation. She had learned the importance of asking for details when faced with vague accusations. Charles reached for a folder on his desk, opening it to reveal what appeared to be several letters and documents. "The Children's Trust has expressed confusion about your mental health initiative," he said, reading from one of the papers. "They feel that it duplicates work they've been doing for decades and worry about public confusion regarding which organization to support." Kate felt a chill run through her. The Children's Trust was indeed an established charity, but her work had been carefully coordinated to complement rather than compete with their efforts. She had personally met with their leadership multiple times to ensure collaborative rather than conflicting approaches. "I had several meetings with their team," she said carefully. "We agreed on complementary focuses. My initiative targets early intervention in schools, while their work focuses on clinical treatment. Different audiences, different approaches." "That's what we thought too," Camilla interjected smoothly. "But apparently the public messaging has been unclear. People are confused about which charity to support, which programs to participate in. It's causing real problems for their fundraising efforts." Kate felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. If major charities were complaining about her work, it could severely damage not just her individual projects, but her entire credibility within the royal system. But something about the timing and nature of these complaints felt suspicious. "May I ask when these concerns were first raised?" she asked, still maintaining her composed demeanor. Charles consulted the papers again. "The letters are dated over the past several days," he said. "Since our family meeting, actually." The timeline struck Kate as oddly convenient. Major charitable organizations typically took weeks or months to formulate and formalize complaints about royal initiatives. For multiple concerns to surface within days of her tense meeting with Camilla suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate orchestration. "I'd like the opportunity to address these concerns directly with the organizations involved," Kate said. "I believe there may be some misunderstandings that could be easily resolved through direct communication." "Of course," Camilla said quickly, too quickly. "But in the meantime, it might be wise to pause these initiatives until the confusion can be sorted out. We wouldn't want to cause further damage to these important partnerships." Kate felt her careful composure beginning to crack slightly. The suggestion that her work was causing damage to anything was both unfair and professionally devastating. More importantly, pausing her initiatives would effectively kill them. Charitable momentum was notoriously difficult to rebuild once lost. "With respect," Kate said, her voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath the politeness, "I think pausing would send the wrong message. It would suggest that the royal family doesn't fully support the work, which could damage these causes far more than any temporary confusion." Charles looked uncomfortable, glancing between his wife and daughter-in-law with an expression that suggested he was beginning to realize he had been placed in an impossible position. "We need to be strategic about this," he said finally. "The monarchy's credibility depends on our ability to work effectively with established institutions." It was then that Kate noticed something that made her breath catch slightly. One of the documents on Charles's desk was partially visible, and she could see letterhead that looked familiar. It was from an organization she knew well, one whose leadership she had met with just a week before, and who had been enthusiastic about her upcoming projects. "May I see the letter from St. Catherine's Foundation?" she asked, naming the organization whose letterhead she had glimpsed. Charles hesitated, glancing at Camilla, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I don't think that's necessary," he said. "The important thing is addressing the concerns, not debating their source." But Kate had seen enough to confirm her growing suspicion. She had worked with St. Catherine's Foundation for over 2 years. Their director had personally assured her of their support just days earlier. For them to suddenly express concern seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. "I think there may be some misinformation involved here," Kate said, choosing her words very carefully. "I'd like to request an independent review of these concerns before making any decisions about pausing my work." Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something cold and calculating passing across her features before being quickly replaced by concerned sympathy. "Oh, Kate, I understand how difficult this must be. When you've put so much passion into a project, it's hard to hear criticism. But sometimes what's best for the institution requires personal sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air like a challenge. Kate realized that this conversation was about much more than charitable partnerships or public infusion. This was about power, about position, about who would have influence over the direction of royal charitable work. "I've always been willing to make sacrifices for the good of the institution," Kate replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "But I believe effective sacrifice requires accurate information. If organizations truly have concerns about my work, I want to address them properly, not simply abandon projects that could benefit millions of people." Charles cleared his throat, clearly struggling with the dynamics at play in his own study. "Perhaps we should arrange for you to meet directly with the organizations involved," he suggested. "Clear communication might resolve these issues more effectively than speculation." It was a reasonable suggestion, and Kate could see Camilla's slight frustration at her husband's diplomatic instincts. But Kate also realized that such meetings would likely reveal the true nature of these concerns, which might not align with the narrative that had been presented to Charles. "I think that's an excellent idea," Kate said, feeling her confidence returning slightly. "I'd also like William to be involved in those discussions, as these initiatives have been part of our joint charitable strategy from the beginning." The mention of William clearly caught Camilla off guard. She had perhaps assumed that Kate would face these challenges alone, without the support of her husband's position and influence. But Kate had learned the importance of allies in navigating royal politics. Of course, Charles agreed, though Kate noticed Camilla's expression had become noticeably cooler. "We'll arrange meetings with the relevant organizations. In the meantime, perhaps it would be wise to proceed carefully with any new announcements or initiatives." It wasn't the complete suspension that had been suggested initially, but it was still a limitation on Kate's work. She nodded graciously, understanding that this was likely the best outcome she could achieve in the current circumstances. As the meeting concluded and farewells were exchanged, Kate maintained her composure perfectly. She thanked Charles for his time and consideration, acknowledged Camilla's helpful insights, and promised to remain focused on what was best for the royal family's charitable work. But as she walked back to her car, Kate's mind was working furiously. She had successfully navigated another challenging encounter, maintaining her dignity and securing at least the opportunity to address the concerns directly. However, she now understood that she was facing a campaign rather than isolated incidents. The realization was both frightening and clarifying. Kate had always known that royal life involved complex politics and competing interests, but she had perhaps naively assumed that shared commitment to public service would override personal ambitions and rivalries. Now she understood that her success, her popularity, and her independence were being perceived as threats rather than assets. The question was no longer how to avoid conflict, but how to protect her ability to continue the work she was passionate about while maintaining her position within a family that was becoming increasingly divided. As her car pulled away from Clarence's house, Kate realized that keeping her composure was no longer just about maintaining dignity in difficult moments. It had become a strategic necessity for survival in a battle she was only beginning to understand. And while she had won this particular encounter, she suspected that the war was far from over.